When the world goes quiet, some voices still remain. Not every soul finds peace when the clock strikes 12. There are stories hidden in the shadows, whispers drifting between the living and the forgotten. Some stories linger, some souls don't leave. Welcome to Stillness After Midnight, where every silence tells a story. If you're drawn to the mysteries that stir after dark, the voices that echo when the world sleeps, subscribe now and join us as we listen to the souls who still have something to say, because in the stillness, the truth finally speaks. Have you ever woken up in a place that didn't belong to the world? No ceiling, no floor, no walls, no shadows, just whiteness, a suffocating blankness that stretches forever, but somehow presses in on you at the same time. That's where I woke up, and I knew, immediately, I was no longer among the living. There was no pain, no blood, no sound. Just a cold realization crawling along the edges of my mind like static on an old screen. I remembered the bus, the brakes that never screamed, the sudden weightlessness, the silence that followed, and then this. In the center of the white void stood a metal table, steel gray and surgical. On it rested a single object, a red button. It was absurd in its simplicity, like something out of a cartoon or a social experiment. A flat disc, the color of freshly spilled blood, glowing faintly against the sterile emptiness. I was alone, but I felt watched, judged, not by eyes, but by presence, by whatever force built this place. A line of black text appeared above the button, suspended in air as if carved into space itself. Press it, if you dare. I laughed. A dry, cracked thing. It was the kind of prompt meant for people like me. Hackers, tinkerers, puzzle solvers, button pushers, literally and metaphorically. I didn't flinch at challenges. I dismantled them. That was my thing. I was Noah. Online, I was Echidna, a name chosen to be untraceable, to wear like armor, a phantom on the net. I hacked government registries at 15, walked through hospital firewalls like open doors at 19, not for profit, not for revenge, just for fun, for the thrill of showing that I could. Rules were illusions. I broke them because no one else could. So I pressed the button, and the room changed. The air thickened. The white void darkened slightly, as if reality took one breath in and held it. A new shape materialized. A screen, floating in the void, crackling to life like an old VHS monitor. It showed a hospital room, pale green walls, medical machinery blinking softly. A girl in a hospital gown, 6, maybe 7, lay unconscious on a bed, her chest rising and falling with help from a ventilator. She looked so small. The video timestamp read, 5 days ago. I didn't understand until the screen glitched and froze. Another line of text appeared underneath. When you hacked the hospital system, her surgery schedule was deleted. The delay cost her life. She died waiting. The words didn't hit me like a hammer. They seeped in, cold, wet, like standing in freezing rain and not noticing you're shivering until it's too late. No, I muttered. No, that can't be right. But it was. I knew the breach it referred to. One of my most celebrated stunts. I'd bragged about it in a forum, even posted snippets of the vulnerability I'd exploited. It had been easy. Too easy. I thought I'd gotten in, caused a harmless reboot, then left. I never thought about schedules, or surgeries, or children, because data isn't human until it is. I stumbled backward. My foot hit nothing. The space had no depth, no edge, and yet I stayed rooted to some invisible ground. A sound began playing, low at first, then louder, the flatline tone of a heart monitor. It didn't stop. Another message blinked into the air. One press, one death, welcome to your consequence. A second button appeared, same shape, Same blood-red glow. I didn't press this one. Instead, I screamed, "What is this place? Who are you?" No response. No voice. No figure. Just me, the buttons, and the deaths they carried. That was when I realized this wasn't hell, not in the religious sense. There were no flames, no devils, no pits of suffering. This was logic. This was consequence coded into space, a kind of divine operating system, one designed not to punish, but to reveal. I wasn't being tortured, I was being shown. Back when I was alive, people said I lacked empathy. I disagreed. I donated to causes. I wrote helpful code. I even patched systems I broke when I felt like it. I believed that because I didn't intend to harm anyone, then I wasn't responsible. I pressed buttons. Systems crashed. People fixed them. End of story. Except it wasn't the end for her. The girl on the screen didn't get a second chance. Her parents didn't get a reboot. Her body didn't accept the delay. Somewhere in the real world, she was buried while I sipped my coffee and wrote code. All because I wanted to prove that I could. The button didn't lie. I killed her. I sat down, or tried to. The space beneath me yielded like invisible silk, enough to let my weight rest. I covered my face, trying to block out the light, the whiteness, the silence. But even in the dark of my palms, I saw her eyes. Closed forever. I whispered, "I didn't know." And something in the room whispered back, "You didn't ask." Those three words shattered whatever illusions I had left. I had never asked, not once. Not about the people, not about the downstream effects, not about what might break that I wouldn't see. Because the systems I hacked weren't just code. They were arteries, they were lifelines. They were bridges between desperate hands and medical miracles. And I had cut them, just to hear the snap. The red button was still glowing. Now I understood what it meant. Not a puzzle, not a trap, a choice. Every day and for every line of code, for every fun intrusion, I had made a choice. And choices demand consequences, not punishment, just reckoning. No voice in this place would scream at me. No God would point a finger. Just mirrors, just cause and effect. That's the cruelty and the justice of it. I stood up, legs trembling. There was no going back, no resurrection. I was dead, and not in the romantic, floating into light kind of way. I was stuck here, in the white, with my sins. And yet, part of me wanted more. Not more punishment, more truth. I had lived my life pressing buttons without seeing what they did. Now I would see them all. Every press, every victim, every consequence. I owed them that, especially her. I thought the worst part would be the silence, but it was the absence of accusation. No voice thundered down from the sky. No tribunal appeared in robes to pass judgment. No glowing entity pronounced me guilty. There was no sentencing, no screaming, not even a whisper. Just the stillness, sharp, clean, inescapable, like breath held forever. I waited for something, anything. Instead, another screen bloomed into view. This one didn't show a child in a hospital bed. It showed a man, middle-aged, tired eyes, clutching a phone in one hand and a printed piece of paper in the other. His lips moved in the footage, frantic. Behind him, nurses shook their heads. A medical receptionist tapped her screen and frowned. The screen froze. The same voice, not voice, returned, not with sound, but with truth. Incorrect dosage administered, autofill algorithm disrupted, system crash caused by your patch. My patch. I remembered that one. It wasn't even a serious job. I had already broken into the hospital's inner workings days before, but I noticed a vulnerability in their medication software, a memory leak in the way it handled database calls. I'd written a fix, not for them, for me as a kind of personal challenge. I had deployed it silently just to see if I could. It wasn't tested, it wasn't reviewed. And now I saw the ripple it created. The man's wife had been prescribed medication for a post-surgical infection. The nurse used the autofill. The autofill used the system I had disrupted. The result was too much. She never made it out of the ICU. I hadn't deleted a life. I had rewritten it. Badly. The room shifted again. Or maybe it didn't. Maybe it was me. I was still standing on nothing. Still breathing air that wasn't air. Still drowning in the echo of the deaths I caused. And yet, I felt watched. But not by a god. By consequence. This place didn't need angels or devils. Didn't need judgment. It was built on an older law. Something deeper than morality. It was the arithmetic of action. Input. Output. Press a button. Break a line of code. Recompile someone's fate. And now, for the first time in my life, I could see the full equation. A new screen. This one showed a nurse, young, maybe early 20s, sobbing alone in a locker room. The overlay text appeared. Lost her job after multiple patient files were corrupted. Blamed herself. Attempted suicide 6 months later. Another victim, not of my code, not directly, but of the system failure I had triggered when I overloaded their database logs with dummy data. Another stunt, another game. I thought it would be clever to see if they could detect it. They couldn't. Logs were overwritten, backups failed. She had to explain that to families. She couldn't. And no one had explained to her that the ghost behind the screen was a bored hacker somewhere far away, smiling at a screen as her life fell apart. I collapsed. The floor was still nothing, but it held me. My hands trembled. This wasn't hell. This was math. Emotionless, efficient, precise, and still, there was no voice accusing me. No God, no demon, no official verdict. That was the punishment, to carry guilt with no sentence. Because a sentence would mean closure, and closure is mercy, I tried to speak. Why are you showing me this? The air shimmered. Another text appeared. Because you thought you left no fingerprints, but every ghost you created remembers your touch. I cried. Not the loud kind, not cinematic tears, just quiet sobs that spilled out like corrupted data. Broken, glitching. It wasn't just the deaths. It was how little I had cared, how easily I had justified myself. I didn't mean for this, I whispered. Another line. Intent is not immunity. I used to joke with friends that hacking wasn't violence. It was elegance. A few lines of code and the world bent. Systems bowed. Firewalls folded. What I never saw was the aftermath. The administrator losing their job. The patient losing their chance. The nurse losing her confidence. When you're behind a screen, the world feels like fiction. And when you treat reality like fiction, people become expendable. Characters in a game you're not afraid to break. I curled into myself. The weight of guilt isn't heavy in a physical sense. It's more like static in the soul, a constant buzzing, a coldness that doesn't come from the room, but from within. I wanted someone to scream at me, tell me I was a monster. But this place didn't do rage. It did mirrors. And mirrors were worse, because the more I saw, the less I could lie. Then for the first time, the space darkened. Not fully, just enough for the white void to feel more like a spotlight and for the shadows to return. And in front of me appeared a new form. Me. Or rather, a version of me. My reflection, age 22, hoodie, smug grin, sitting at my desk surrounded by monitors. The moment I cracked the CDC system, the first time I used a stolen admin login to bypass a national hospital network, I watched myself laugh, watched myself lean back in the chair like I was untouchable, watched myself say, out loud, too easy. They should have paid me to find this. I wanted to scream at him, at me. I wanted to grab that self by the collar and say, do you know who you just killed? But I didn't, because that version of me wouldn't have listened. He would have rolled his eyes, said I was being dramatic, said systems recover, said hospitals have backups, said it's not his job to hold their system together, that Noah thought being clever excused being cruel, that Noah believed his detachment made him neutral. But detachment isn't neutral. Detachment is cowardice wrapped in arrogance. And now in this white, wordless courtroom, I was being sentenced not by some higher being, but by the truth I refused to face in life. I stood again. This place didn't offer verdicts. It offered clarity. I was the prosecutor. I was the defense. I was the accused. And I was the judge. There would be no gavel, no final ruling, just the mirror, just the screens, just the bloodless, brutal unfolding of every action I ever dismissed. And there were many more to come. I could feel it, the weight of still unseen damage waiting to surface, waiting to be shown. One video at a time, one consequence per day, one thread at a time being pulled from the web I had tangled. No bars, no chains, just accountability. The kind you can't escape by logging out. And that, I realized, was what made this place worse than hell. In hell, you burn. Here, you understand. They used to call me brilliant. In dark corners of cyberspace where masks were usernames and reputations were built in code, I was echidna, a digital phantom with a flawless track record of breaking into the unbreakable. Government sites, banking APIs, hospital systems, educational databases. If it had a firewall, I could find the crack. And if it had a lock, I could pick it. They admired me not for what I destroyed, but for how elegantly I did it. Scripts that slipped through like whispers, payloads that danced around detection, exploits written like poetry. I was 22 and revered. And worst of all, I believed it meant something. That version of me, the boy genius draped in ego, felt invincible. Every system he bypassed was another reminder that the world was built by flawed people using flawed code. I didn't see people. I saw patterns, vulnerabilities, opportunities to prove my superiority. Power was measured in how quickly I could collapse a digital fortress. Respect was counted in how many firewalls I broke. And guilt, it was optional, decorative, an accessory for the less talented, because I wasn't hurting anyone. At least that's what I told myself. Now, standing in this sterile afterlife, if that's even what this place is, I see it differently. Power was never mine. It was borrowed, stolen even. Every time I breached a system, I thought I was ascending, transcending, showing the architects of those systems that I was smarter, faster, better. But I wasn't climbing a ladder. I was tearing down bridges, and people were still trying to cross. Another screen appeared. This time, it wasn't death or despair. It was admiration. A teenage boy in his bedroom, glowing in the light of 3 monitors. My online handle, Echidna, was on the screen. He was watching one of my talks. A conference panel I joined under a fake name, bragging about ethical hacking, social engineering, vulnerability testing. His eyes sparkled. He looked at me like I had the answers, like I was a legend. I remembered that boy. I didn't know his name, but I knew the type. Young, curious, dangerously smart, hungry to matter. And I had shown him that to matter, you had to break things. The room didn't judge me. It just showed me. Another screen. This one flickered to footage of a small-town hospital. Servers down, nurses scrambling, lights flickering in surgery rooms. The cause, a distributed denial of service, DDoS attack launched by a botnet, built using code I had once open-sourced. Just for fun. The boy had copied it. He had no idea what it would do, and I had no idea who it would hurt. Power, I once thought, was the ability to bend systems. Now I knew the truth. Power is nothing without responsibility, and without empathy, it's not power, it's a weapon. I sat down in the nothingness again, knees pulled to my chest. How many times had I whispered, "It's just code," to absolve myself? It wasn't just code. It was surgery schedules, drug prescriptions, emergency protocols, lives. Every piece of data had a heartbeat. I didn't see that because I didn't want to, because seeing it meant admitting I wasn't just a genius. I was dangerous. A new message floated across the white void. You were never building anything. You only knew how to break. That stung. Because it was true. I had mastered destruction, not creation. I could dismantle 1,000 systems, but I never wrote one that saved a life. Never built an application that brought comfort. Never protected what I could have defended. Because to build requires patience, empathy, understanding. To break only requires ego. And oh, I had plenty of that. I remember one breach. I got into a pediatric clinic's network in under 40 minutes. Posted the proof, a single screenshot, on an underground forum with the caption, "If this is how you protect kids, God help them." The irony makes me sick now, because God didn't help them. And I certainly didn't. I used to think of power as something binary. Either you had it or you didn't. Either you were the hacker or the hacked, predator or prey. But I missed the middle, the in-between, the space where people lived, fragile, connected, vulnerable, where systems weren't abstract puzzles, but lifelines, where code wasn't a playground, but a breathing lung in a body too complex to comprehend. And when I played my games there, I wasn't proving brilliance. I was revealing blindness. The room dimmed again. I looked up, expecting another screen. But instead, words, only words, appeared above me. You mistook control for wisdom and confusion for superiority. I shook my head. I just wanted to be seen. The words shifted. You were, but not by the people you thought. That's the thing about illusion. It feeds on attention, and I had plenty of that. Fellow hackers respected me. Forums praised me. Even companies feared me. But the people who suffered because of me, they didn't know my name. Only the damage I left behind. That wasn't power. That was cowardice, hiding behind cleverness. And now in this eternal white box, there were no fans, only echoes. A final screen appeared. This time, it was me, but older, tired, haunted. I was sitting at a desk, eyes hollow, hands shaking above a keyboard I no longer wanted to touch. The future that might have been if I had lived long enough to regret rather than die in the middle of the lie. I watched as that version of me hovered over a send button, an apology email drafted to the very hospital I had hacked. He never pressed it. He deleted it. And I realized the only difference between power and redemption is the willingness to face consequence. I hadn't faced anything, not until now. I stood. The white room didn't change, but I did. For the first time, I felt the weight of everything, not just the dead, but the disillusioned. The systems I broke weren't just code. They were trust. And trust, once shattered, echoes forever in the lives of those who needed stability the most. I whispered into the nothing. What happens now? No answer. Just one last message, suspended in silence. Now you see clearly, and that's where power ends, and responsibility begins. They say words can kill, but no one ever warned me about code. Not the way it should have been warned, not the way it deserved to be feared. We talked about logic, syntax, performance. We joked about crashing systems and bringing down servers. We treated code like a toy, a sword we swung in invisible space. We laughed when we got 500 errors. We celebrated zero-day exploits like party tricks. But no one ever told me that a single misplaced character, a forgotten condition, an unchecked input could bleed into someone's life like poison. I know now because I wrote one, just one line, and someone died. The screen appeared like the others, softly, silently, without drama. It showed a pharmacy interface, the kind hospital staff use to manage prescriptions. I recognized the UI. I'd been in that system once, just once. There was a line of code I had changed, a line meant to suppress a warning message that annoyed me. The pop-up kept crashing my terminal during testing, so I commented it out. I told myself I'd re-enable it when I was done. I never did. On screen, a nurse confirmed a medication dose. The warning never appeared. The dose was too high. The patient was 84. His heart failed 3 minutes later, all because I was annoyed. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. There was no energy left for that. Just a quiet kind of collapse inside myself, like an old bridge finally giving way. What do you do when faced with a death that's traced back to a decision you don't even remember making? There was no intent. There was no anger. There wasn't even malice, just carelessness. And carelessness in code is cruelty in disguise. I used to pride myself on how fast I wrote. 100 lines per hour, no comments, no fluff, pure, elegant, efficient logic. Now I see the opposite. Every line I wrote without testing, every shortcut I took to save time, every block I copied from somewhere else and never fully understood. They weren't elegant. They were dangerous. Because when code touches lives, there is no such thing as just a quick fix. There is only consequence. The space around me rippled, not violently, like water remembering a stone that was thrown hours ago. And then I saw something I didn't expect. A funeral. Not mine. His. The 84-year-old man. He had been a grandfather, a violinist, a veteran. The footage showed his family, his daughter delivering a eulogy through trembling breath, his grandson clenching his small fist beside the casket. Not understanding. Not yet. They didn't know my name. They only knew the system failed. And when systems fail, they don't say, "A hacker did this." They say, "We're sorry. There was a malfunction. We'll investigate." But behind those words, there's always someone. And this time, it was me. I whispered. I didn't know. The system replied in silence. Not because it was cruel, but because it shouldn't have to answer that. Ignorance doesn't erase consequence. The screen faded. I stared at the spot where it had been, as if my guilt could bring it back, as if I deserved to see his face one more time. But this place didn't offer comfort, only mirrors. And I was starting to realize this wasn't punishment, this was education. A final course I never signed up for, where the subject was human cost and the curriculum was my own history. I used to joke, it's not a bug, it's a feature. Now I see every bug in a critical system is a ticking bomb, and every time I joked, someone was walking a little closer to it. It's easy to forget the reach of our code. It doesn't live in the IDE. It doesn't end when we shut the laptop. It seeps into lives, into decisions, into machines connected to lungs, veins, hearts. We don't write scripts. We write consequences. I began to remember other times I had been careless. The time I disabled a logging system because it slowed my queries. The time I bypassed input validation because the form annoyed me. The time I changed a variable name in one place but forgot the other and never tested it. Each one was a match dropped in a forest. Some maybe fizzled out, but some ignited wildfires. And I never stayed long enough to see what burned. The whiteness around me dimmed, as if recoiling. I looked down at my hands. They weren't bloodied, but they were shaking. It's a strange thing to feel remorse for keystrokes, but that's the reality of this new world. Or perhaps the truth that always existed, which I had refused to see. Code in the hands of the careless is no different than a scalpel in the hands of the blind. And I had wielded it with arrogance. A question formed in the air, written in thin black lines. Did you ever test your assumptions? I knew the answer. No. Not really. I tested outcomes, but never consequences. Because testing outcomes is about performance. Testing consequences requires empathy. The screen returned one last time before vanishing into the void. This time it wasn't a tragedy, it was me. younger, sitting at my terminal. Music playing in the background, my fingers moving fast over the keys. I was writing the line. That line. The one I had commented out. I looked happy, carefree. I saw how lightly my fingers danced, how proud I was of shaving milliseconds from my script, how I smiled at the terminal like I had outwitted the machine. But I hadn't. I had outwitted the warning, and in doing so, betrayed the very purpose of what I claimed to respect. It was one line, just one. But when that line intersected with reality, with people, with bodies, with mortality, it didn't matter how clever I was. What mattered was what it did. I stood again. This room didn't let you rest for long. I knew more was coming. More screens, more ghosts, more truths I had ignored. But for this moment, this quiet, breathless moment, I allowed myself to say it, out loud, to no one and to everyone. I'm sorry, not to the system, not to the abstract idea of the hospital, but to the man, to his daughter, to the nurse who trusted the interface, to the silence that followed the flat line. I'm sorry for the line. I'm sorry for the logic. I'm sorry for pretending it wasn't mine. The white world didn't respond, but I didn't need it to, because this chapter, unlike the code I once wrote, had been tested, and this time I understood its impact. There's something seductive about numbers. They never complain, never bleed, never cry. They sit obediently behind the veil of abstraction, in columns and logs and packets of data flowing through wires. You can sort them, delete them, reroute them, and not once do they resist. They behave, or so I thought. In my world, numbers were shields. They kept me detached. They made the human cost invisible, until the day I realized that even numbers can weep. I stood once again in the endless white. No floor, no walls, no sky, only the illusion of stillness, the kind that comes before the mirror cracks. A new screen emerged, rising slowly out of the void like a memory that refuses to stay buried. This one didn't show a person, not at first. It showed a spreadsheet, rows and rows of numerical entries, all neatly aligned, patient IDs, blood types, priority levels, operation schedules. It was the hospital's surgical queue. I felt a cold prickle along my arms. I knew this sheet. I had seen it, in passing, when I breached the system months ago. I remembered thinking how inefficient the table looked. No error handling, no redundancy. I even joked to myself, they're running this like a bakery queue. What I didn't realize was that in that brief moment of mockery, I had changed something. A script I had injected into the system to map data for my visualizer. It reordered the priority field. Lexicographically, the screen shifted. Suddenly, the numbers changed. A patient with a P2 designation moved ahead of one marked P1. Another shifted down 3 spots. Someone disappeared entirely. And then, faces. Attached to those numbers. Suddenly real. A young woman with stage 4 cancer. Her surgery delayed 3 days. An elderly man with a ruptured intestine pushed down the queue until his body gave up. A 6-year-old girl, yes, her again, whose emergency tag was reclassified as non-urgent. Not by a doctor, not by neglect, by me, by a sort algorithm, by a line of code I forgot to delete after I ran my analysis. I felt sick, not metaphorically, truly physically ill, as if the truth had become a virus crawling through my veins, replicating remorse, because now I saw the numbers differently. They weren't entries. They were names not spoken, faces not seen, tears not witnessed. They were the cries I had silenced with syntax. I whispered, I didn't mean to. The room responded, not with voice, but with vision. It showed a woman, the mother of the girl. Her hands clutched a paper printout, the surgery schedule. She was screaming at a nurse, crying that her daughter had been marked low risk. that her condition had worsened, that no one would listen. And she was right, because the system had said she was wrong, because I had told the system so, without knowing, without caring, without staying to check what I'd broken. I had once believed that code was pure, that logic was immune to morality, that if it compiled, it was clean, that if it worked, it was safe. But I understand now. Code without compassion is the most dangerous weapon we've ever built. Another screen appeared. This one displayed logs, entries, timestamps, flags. The hospital had spent weeks trying to trace the error in the priority queue. It had cascaded. A dozen patients affected, 3 deaths, multiple lawsuits, staff terminated. But the script? It had long since self-deleted. No trace of me, no signature, no fingerprints, just ghosts. That's the cruelty of abstraction. It lets you destroy without witnessing destruction. You type one line in your bedroom, and a family mourns in silence halfway across the world. And because you never see them, you tell yourself it's not your fault. But now that I'm here, I see them, all of them. And what haunts me most is not that I made a mistake. It's that I made it quietly. No explosion, no fire, just a ripple. So small I never noticed it. So vast it drowned people I never met. The screen dissolved. In its place, a mirror. But this time, I didn't see myself. I saw the spreadsheet again. But every number now had eyes. Some were closed, some filled with tears. Some just stared, hollow, lost, betrayed. And I realized, the numbers always knew. They always held the pain. I just refused to see it. I stepped forward and the mirror followed me. No matter where I went, the numbers did too. Like shadows cast not by light, but by action. There had been a time, not long ago, when I'd laughed at system inefficiencies. I'd mocked bad UIs, scoffed at legacy infrastructure, thought of hospitals as slow-moving, outdated relics. But now I understood why they move slowly. Because when lives are involved, caution isn't weakness, it's mercy. And when I barged in, fast, clever, reckless, I didn't improve anything. I corrupted it. Not out of hate, out of indifference. And that, I now know, is worse. Another message hovered above me, written in soft gray. You treated the numbers like they couldn't bleed, but every value you touched carried a heartbeat. I couldn't look at it, because it was true, and because I knew this was only one of many. If this happened from one script, what else had I forgotten? What other lines, other changes, other experiments? How many more numbers had cried silently while I celebrated another successful breach? I fell to my knees. Again. Not from punishment, from truth. That was the sentence of this place. Not fire, not chains. Clarity. And still, the spreadsheet floated in the void. Rows upon rows of consequence. I could scroll forever, but I didn't want to, because now every digit was a confession. So I did the only thing left to do. I bowed my head, not in prayer, but in apology. To every number I touched, to every name I didn't learn, to every cry I converted into silence. I see you now, and I am sorry. The screen blinked once, and then vanished. But the echoes, they stayed. Because numbers never truly die. They just wait to be understood. The screen didn't flicker this time. It glared, bright, brutal, unblinking, like the moment before a car crash, when you realize you've made a mistake and the world isn't going to wait for you to fix it. At the top of the screen was a message I couldn't look away from. Error, unknown failure. Origin, patch injected by unauthorized user classification, non-system anomaly. Impact, irreversible. It didn't say my name, but it didn't need to. I recognized the code at the bottom. A digital fingerprint no one else would see but me. A string of variables I used in all my tests. A sarcastic tag I embedded into every line, just for fun. Funny, no one dies. I stared at that line for what felt like hours. It had been a joke, a quiet taunt to the universe, my little rebellion. No one dies, I said, because I believed I could pierce systems without drawing blood. But now that comment was carved into a death certificate I could never erase. The screen shifted, and a hospital monitor room came into view. Several staff were staring at terminals. One nurse pointed at the screen, confused. Then came the cascade. Alert failed to trigger. A patient's vitals dropped. The automated page never went through. By the time anyone noticed, it was too late. I whispered, but the system should have caught that. And the space around me seemed to answer. Not in sound, but in silence so sharp it felt like glass pressed to my throat. That's the difference between blame and truth. Blame looks for shields. Truth looks for roots. And the root of this failure wasn't the alert system. It was me. I had built a script to test the hospital's fallback protocols. Nothing malicious, just curiosity. I injected false vitals, fake alerts, wanted to see how it would handle the stress. It handled it fine, until I forgot to remove the flag. That flag redirected alerts to a dev server I never turned off. One line, one redirect, one patient who never got help. I thought systems were solid, that they had fail-safes, backup triggers, redundancy. But that's the lie we tell ourselves when we want to believe the harm isn't ours. Because even the best systems aren't designed for malice wearing curiosity's mask. And I wore that mask well. The room began to change again. It folded inward. I was no longer standing in a void. I was inside the hospital, but not really. It was like a simulation, a reconstructed memory stitched together from data, like a dream that someone else had dreamed before me. I stood in the IT room. I watched technicians replay logs. I saw them reading the same error I saw earlier, non-system anomaly. One of them sighed. There's no bug. It's human error. Someone did this. They didn't know who. They'd never find out. But I knew. And that's when it hit me. The most terrifying thing of all. It wasn't a system error. It wasn't even a human error. It was my error. And no one would ever know. That's the paradox of hacking. When you fail, no one sees you. When you succeed, no one sees the cost. I had lived in that paradox for years. Invisible, untraceable, unblamed. And that, I now realize, was the greatest failure of all. Because without consequence, I never stopped. Without accountability, I never questioned myself. And now the blood was real. It wasn't metaphor. It wasn't theory. It was on my hands, and no one knew it but me. The room shifted again. I was in a hospital hallway now, watching a janitor quietly clean blood off the floor outside an ICU. He didn't know me. He didn't know code. He didn't know that the page didn't go through. All he knew was that someone died behind that door, and someone had to clean up after it. The system had failed, they said, but the system was working. It was just redirected. By me. The screen returned once more, showing a graph of response times, a blip. One anomaly. Just 30 seconds. But 30 seconds is a lifetime in critical care. It's the space between breath and suffocation, between heartbeat and silence, between survival and a toe tag. And I caused that gap. Not with a virus, not with a ransom, just with a mistake. So no, it wasn't a system error. It was a human error. And worse, it was an unseen one. Those are the deadliest kinds, because you don't fix what you can't see. And I had hidden it so well, I almost convinced myself it never happened. Until now. Now I was trapped in a place that showed me everything. No filters, no logs to delete, no excuses to write, just clarity. And here's the truth I couldn't deny anymore. Systems are only as safe as the people who touch them. And people like me, arrogant, unsupervised, praised for speed instead of responsibility. We were the weakest link. We didn't break the systems. We bent them. We made them almost safe. almost reliable, almost trustworthy, but almost doesn't save lives, almost kills. A final message appeared before me, pulsing gently in the air. The system did not fail. It followed its last command. And that command, that flawed, forgotten line, came from me. I stood in the middle of the simulation, surrounded by ghosts, doctors who blamed themselves, technicians who never found the cause, families who would never know why the alarm didn't go off, and me, the only one who knew, because I had built the flaw, and I had hidden it too well. For years, I had bragged about being untraceable. Now I saw what that really meant. I left a trail of harm no one could follow. No justice, no apology, just wounds that never healed. I wanted to scream, to confess, to turn back time. But this wasn't hell. This was consequence. And consequence doesn't listen. It only shows. So I stood there in the hallway that wasn't real but felt too real. And I whispered not to God, not to the machine, not even to the system, but to myself. I was the error, and no patch can fix that. You don't get to walk away from guilt. Not here, not anymore. Back in the world, guilt was something you could mute. A dull echo behind your accomplishments. A quiet rustle behind the applause. When people called me brilliant, I let their words bury the voices of those I might have hurt. When they admired my skill, I let that admiration rewrite the truth. I let it build a shield, something polished, hard, untouchable. But now in this endless, white, judging silence, there's no place for shields. Here, guilt isn't a whisper. It's the air. I don't know how long I stood there. Time doesn't exist in this place. Not the way it used to. It's measured in clarity. Each moment only begins when a truth appears. And this one came without warning. A screen. My face. Typing alone in the glow of 3 monitors, eyes glazed from too much pride, too little sleep. Fingers flying, logic flowing, a soft grin on my lips. Not cruel, but careless. I was writing the patch that would alter the hospital's scheduling queue, the very one that shifted priorities, the one that demoted a child's case from emergency to routine. And I had no idea what I was doing, no intention to harm, no vision of what would come. I was just focused, drunk on speed, convinced that getting it to work meant I had done enough. I had never once asked, who will this affect? And suddenly the screen blurred. The walls of the white room flickered like static. My heartbeat, if I still had one, pounded through the silence. A message appeared in the air. Do you want to reprogram? I stared at the words. Not delete, not undo, not escape. Reprogram. I don't know if it was a question or a command. Maybe both. I nodded. Not because I knew what would come, but because I knew I couldn't go on as I was. Not one more moment. The space didn't change dramatically. No divine light, no system reset. Just a strange warmth behind my eyes, like something inside me had shifted. Something quiet, something slow. Like guilt had stopped hovering around me and started moving through me. For the first time, I began to feel the structure of it. Guilt wasn't an enemy. It was a consequence. A ghost that didn't want revenge, only acknowledgement. A shadow that wasn't there to haunt me, but to guide me. In life, I had treated guilt as a bug to be squashed. I made excuses, laughed it off, told myself there's no way I could have known. But I could have asked, could have checked, could have stayed longer before disappearing into the next project. I didn't. And that absence, that refusal, was the crime. A memory surfaced. Not a screen this time. Just a moment. I was 15, sitting in front of my first terminal, staring at a blinking cursor. I had just bypassed my school's firewall. Nothing major. No real harm. Just access to YouTube in class. My teacher had caught me and asked, "Why do you do this?" I had smiled and said, "Because I can." That same phrase had followed me like a motto. I used it when I breached servers, when I shut down a public website, when I tested hospital infrastructure from the comfort of my bedroom, because I can. But now, I heard it differently. Now it sounded hollow, juvenile, cruel, because behind every "because I can" was a choice, and I had made the same one again and again: to walk away, to move on without looking back, to pretend the system would fix itself. But systems don't fix themselves. People do, and I had never been one of them. So what does it mean to reprogram guilt? It means learning to live with the weight instead of trying to drop it. It means carrying every face I harmed, not as torment, but as a pledge, that I would no longer create in the dark, that I would never again type with numb fingers and blind intent, that every decision from here forward, even in death, would be shaped by the lives it touched. I think guilt was always meant to be a teacher, not a warden, but I had refused to listen, dismissed it, mocked it, and when guilt is ignored long enough, it doesn't disappear. It adapts, hides in the cracks, waits until you can no longer run. That's what this place was. Not a prison, a classroom. One designed for someone like me, who only learns once everything breaks. A soft hum filled the space, like a heartbeat behind a wall. And then, another presence. Not physical, not human, but there, like a breath, or a truth that had taken shape. It didn't speak with words, it didn't accuse. It simply reminded me, your guilt is not your enemy. It's the part of you that survived. I lowered my head. Let the warmth of guilt fill me, flood me, rewire me. Not to destroy me, but to make me useful. If I could no longer change the past, then at the very least, I could carry it with grace. I looked up, and the words returned, this time simple, final, guilt integrated. Continue. No applause, no forgiveness, no salvation, just a quiet shift, like a broken line of code, finally fixed. I always thought life was a game, not in the childish sense, not like playgrounds and reset buttons, but in the way I approached everything. Strategy, advantage, risk, reward. There were players and there were pawns. There were systems to beat, rules to break, back doors to find. And me, I was the kind of player who never lost. At least, that's what I believed. Now I see it clearly. I wasn't playing a game. I was undoing lives. The white space held me like it always had. Not cruelly, not kindly, just completely. There was no sound, but I could hear something. A silence that wasn't empty. A silence that waited. And then for the first time, something broke. Not around me, but within. It wasn't pain. It was realization. I didn't know when it began, but I felt it finishing now. The story I told myself, that I was just exploring, just testing, just pushing limits, it was over. That narrative, that arrogant script I'd run my entire life, was reaching its final function. I had arrived at the end of my illusion. The game was over, and I had lost. Not because someone beat me, not because I failed to breach a system, but because I finally understood the cost of playing, and there was no trophy for that, no leaderboard, just consequences. Another screen appeared, but this time it didn't show the face of a victim, or a line of faulty code, or a replay of my mistakes. It showed something I hadn't seen since the moment I died. The button. Red. Still. Waiting. The same one I had pressed the first time. The one that started all this. Above it, a new prompt. One final move. I stared at it, heart beating in memory if not in body. I didn't reach for it. Not yet. Because now I knew. Every button hides a question. The last one had asked, will you act without knowing? This one was different. It asked, will you act after everything you now understand? I walked toward the button slowly. No rush, no thrill, no sense of conquest. I thought about everything I had seen. The girl who never got her surgery, The grandfather who died from a silent alarm, the nurse who blamed herself for a corrupted file, the janitor who mopped up what my script caused, the numbers that bled behind spreadsheets. The families left with questions no system could answer. They were never part of the game, because there was never a game. Just me, my ego, and the machine that let me pretend it wasn't personal. I reached the table, looked down. The button was still red, still glowing faintly, still pulsing like a heartbeat. And then, something new, a reflection, not mine, theirs, all of them, all the lives I'd touched, even for a second. Faces in the red, eyes staring up from beneath the glass, not angry, just waiting. For what? For me to finish the story I started. I thought the end would be dramatic, that the final chapter would come with fire, with judgment, with absolution. But this isn't a story about redemption. It's a story about reckoning. And reckoning doesn't end in applause. It ends in acceptance. I whispered, I see it now. Not to anyone, just to the air, to the ghosts, to the guilt I had reprogrammed, not to vanish, but to guide me. Then I said what I had never said in life. It wasn't a game. It was people, and I failed them. The button blinked once, not to lure me, to acknowledge me, like it had been waiting not for a press, but for that sentence, that confession, that moment when I no longer reached for control, but understood the weight of it. I reached out, and this time my hand didn't tremble. Not because I was fearless, because I was finally aware. Aware that power is not in what you can touch, but in what you choose not to. And so, I did what I never thought I would. I stepped back, from the button, from the choice, from the illusion of final say. And that's when the light changed. Subtle, soft, like dawn after a long, harrowing night, one you didn't believe would ever end. The space around me didn't vanish, but the pressure lifted. The weight of judgment was no longer crushing, and I knew. This was it. Not escape, not reward, but something better. The end of the game, and the beginning of something real. I turned away from the button, and behind me, where there had once been nothing, stood a doorway, faint, shifting, unlabeled. But I didn't need a name. I had been given what I never gave anyone in life, clarity, and now I would walk with it. Where? I didn't know. That wasn't the point. The point was that I no longer needed to win. I needed to serve. The game was over. And finally, I was ready to begin. I thought stepping away from the button would be the final act. But this place, whatever it was, had no endings, only thresholds. And every time I crossed one, I wasn't set free. I was handed a deeper question. The doorway appeared after I turned my back on the red button. It didn't shimmer like salvation. It didn't hum like resolution. It just waited, still and gray, like it had always been there. As if it had always known I'd come to this point. As if it had no interest in judging me, only showing me what remained. I stepped through it, barefoot on nothing, and found myself in a new space. Not white, but glass. Walls stretched infinitely in all directions, each one a mirror. Ceiling, mirrored. Floor, mirrored. It was a room of infinite reflections, shimmering and silent. At first I saw myself, or thought I did, 1,000 versions of Noah, standing alone, ghost pale, wide-eyed. But then, the reflections shifted. They blinked. They changed. They became others. One mirror held the face of a woman, hollow-eyed, sitting alone at a kitchen table. Another showed a man in hospital scrubs, staring at a corrupted patient file. Another, a boy, no older than 10, holding a folded flag, trying not to cry. Every mirror held a different moment. Not mine. Theirs. They were the people I had never met. But who had met me? Not in person. In consequence. I didn't know their names. But they knew mine. Not Noah. Not Echidna. Not even as a person. They knew me as failure. A name buried in a crash report, a ghost in a system, the cause of a delay, a bug, a death. I spun slowly in place, surrounded by images. One mirror flickered to show a nurse trembling after inputting a dosage. Another showed a father refreshing a hospital portal that never loaded. Another, the one I couldn't look away from, showed a mother screaming at a touchscreen kiosk that had glitched when she tried to check her daughter's surgery schedule. I remembered that one. She was the first, the child who died waiting, but the mirror didn't show the child, only the mother. Because sometimes loss echoes louder through those who remain. I tried to speak, to apologize, but my voice didn't pass the glass. These weren't interactive screens. They weren't here for me to fix. They were here so I could finally see. Then I noticed something strange. Of all the mirrors surrounding me, not one showed my face anymore. Not my real one. Not the version of me that stood here, stunned and breathless. Only others. Only consequences. It was as if this place no longer cared what I looked like, only what I had left behind. I walked slowly, brushing my fingers along the cold glass of one frame. It didn't ripple, didn't warm, just reflected, perfectly, permanently, a grief I had never been forced to acknowledge until now. I said barely above a whisper, "Why can't I see myself?" And for the first time in a long while, something answered, not in words but in feeling, a weight, a pulse, a truth. Because the version of you that did this no longer exists. I froze, and I understood. The mirrors weren't refusing to show me. They couldn't, because the boy who had written that code, who had grinned at a bypass, who had shut his laptop after watching a system crash, that boy had died long before the bus ever hit him. Not physically, morally. What stood in this room of reflections wasn't him. It was someone rebuilt, piece by piece, from guilt, from truth, from consequence. And you can't reflect what hasn't fully formed yet. One mirror cracked. Just a hairline fracture across the middle. The image within it, a family watching an unresponsive patient monitor, froze in place. The glass shimmered. Then slowly, it began to clear. Not vanish, not heal, but clear. Until all I saw was the family, present, still breathing, still broken, still trying, and something shifted inside me. This wasn't a punishment chamber. It was a reckoning hall. Not just to witness pain, but to hold it, to stop running, to stop hiding behind screens and handles and the cold safety of abstraction. I kept walking, past mirror after mirror, until I reached one that was blank. At first I thought it was a mistake, but the longer I stared, the more I understood. This wasn't an error. It was an invitation. This was the mirror for what comes next. The version of me I still had the power to become. Not in life, but in something else. Maybe legacy, maybe silence, maybe service. And then I felt it. The door. Another threshold. Behind me, the room of mirrors remained, eternal and still. Before me, something new. But this time, I didn't rush. I looked back at every reflection, every face, every cost. And I said, not with regret, but with purpose. I won't forget you, because mirrors, when they no longer reflect you, you become windows into who you must answer to. There's a kind of silence that isn't absence, it's presence. Heavy, dense, alive. It follows you like breath fogging on glass, not blocking the view, but reminding you that something human is still here, watching, waiting, listening. That was the silence I stepped into, beyond the room of mirrors, beyond the moment of reckoning, into the space where memory itself lives. The hallway was long, but not in miles. It was long in meaning. With every step, I felt something loosen inside me. Not pain, not even guilt anymore. Just the strange weight of having seen what I should have seen all along. The faces, the consequences, the truth. The corridor didn't glow. It pulsed. as if it had a heartbeat, as if something deeper, not mechanical, not divine, was preparing itself for my arrival. At the end of the path, a wall appeared, but not blank. There was a screen, small, dim, and centered on it was a cursor, blinking, waiting. Above it, a single line of text. Compose your final message. No explanation, no constraints, no prompt, just a space, a silence, an opportunity. I stood there for a long time, long enough to remember everything, long enough to feel the ghosts gather behind me, not to haunt, but to witness. They were all there, I knew it. The girl in the ICU, the mother at the kiosk, the nurse with the corrupted file, the boy who copied my code, the janitor who cleaned up my mistake. They weren't screaming. They weren't asking for blood. They just waited to see what I would say, not to them, but to the world I had once touched and twisted. I raised my hand. It didn't shake, not because I was confident, but because I was finally ready to write not as a hacker, not as a ghost, but as a witness to my own harm. The screen accepted my words without delay. It didn't question. It didn't autocorrect. It just let me speak. And I wrote, to the ones I never met and never thought about until it was too late. I owe you a truth that cannot undo what I've done. But it must be spoken. I once believed that technology was neutral, that systems were lifeless, that code was just language. And I believed, truly, that my curiosity was harmless. I told myself that because I didn't mean harm, no harm was done. But intention is not the measure. Impact is, and the impact of my actions was death, delay, confusion, loss, suffering. For people who trusted the systems I corrupted, for families who paid for a failure I never stayed to see, for nurses who took the blame I should have shouldered, for children who waited for help that never came. I was not a savior. I was not a genius. I was not a pioneer. I was careless. And in places where carelessness costs lives, that is a form of violence. I want you to know this. Technology did not fail you. I did. I made choices with no regard for the people behind the numbers. I cut corners and called it speed. I broke things and called it discovery. I walked away from responsibility and called it freedom. But I see now, the greatest privilege I had was detachment, and the greatest harm I caused was indifference. If you are reading this and you write code, if you touch systems that touch people, please understand this. Every line you write is a signature. Every system you shape is a promise. Make those promises carefully, because someone will live with what you leave behind. I cannot change what I did, but maybe by leaving this message, I can change what someone else becomes, not by warning them of danger, but by reminding them who the danger can become, and how easily. Thank you for showing me what I refuse to see. I will carry it, all of it, forever. The screen blinked once, then slowly faded to black. No send button, no confirmation, no reply, just silence again. But this time, not heavy, not condemning, just full. Like something complete had landed. Not closure, but clarity. Behind me, the ghosts began to fade. Not because they were gone, but because they had been heard. And when harm is finally acknowledged, some part of it becomes quiet. The room softened, the edges blurred, the hallway dissolved, and I was left in a new space. Not white, not glass, not judgment, just light. For the first time, I wasn't asking, what comes next? Because it didn't matter. The message had been written, the game was over, and now, finally, I wasn't here to win. I was here to witness. In life, I believed every problem had a trail, every crash had a log, every failure had a cause, something I could trace, debug, and patch. Errors were neat things tucked inside red text and brackets, waiting to be fixed with a clever line or a smarter loop. Pain, I believed, worked the same way. There had to be a root, a trigger, a place where it all started, where the system hiccuped and let suffering slip through. But here, in this place beyond code, beyond reason, I discovered the truth. Some pain doesn't raise an alert. Some suffering leaves no report. It just happens, and no one sees it until it's too late. After I sent the final message, I expected silence. But what came was memory, not replayed on a screen, not shown in mirrors, but felt like fire waking beneath skin, like static in a heart that should have stopped beating long ago. I remembered things I hadn't even known I'd forgotten. The sound of my own laugh echoing in an empty room after cracking a health system's firewall. The way I leaned back, hands behind my head, bathing in victory as if it had no smell. The warmth of the coffee I sipped as I watched scripts run their silent sabotage in the background. All while somewhere else, someone was bleeding out in the ER because the patient triage system had stopped responding. I never knew his name. Still don't. But I remember the moment I saw his entry on the casualty list months later, tucked in a PDF posted publicly as part of a system audit. His death had been marked as technical delay, just 2 words, no face, and I skimmed right past it. Because to me then, it wasn't personal. It was data. But now it was personal. Because now I wasn't reading from a file. I was inside the line that failed, and I could feel him. Not see, feel. His confusion, his pain, his belief that help was coming. And then, it didn't. There was no stack trace for that. No flashing alert. No error number. No fix. Just silence where breath should have been. I stumbled in the light, not because the floor shifted, but because I did. Something inside me buckled. For the first time, I understood what it meant to be haunted, not by what I did intentionally, but by what I never stopped to consider. The pain I caused was not always a result of malice. Sometimes it was just the echo of my absence, of my failure to care. I sat down in that soft light. No walls, no ceiling, just this endless glow that felt like awareness. Around me, I could feel the pain I'd left behind in places that no one would ever write a report about. The receptionist who got yelled at by grieving families because records were lost. The EMT who had to make life or death calls without access to patient allergies. The developer who inherited my sabotage and thought he was the one who made the mistake. The hospital's IT admin who drank alone in his car after being blamed for a breach he never caused. None of them made the news. None of them got a headline. But they all carried something I gave them. We don't always hurt people by what we do. Sometimes we hurt them by what we enable. By setting failure in motion and walking away before it finishes unfolding. And no system has a field for that. No form labeled, "What unseen negligence altered your life today?" I wanted to scream. Not to undo anything. That time had passed. I wanted to scream because now I understood. Pain that isn't witnessed doesn't disappear. It lingers, dormant, buried, but real. And sometimes it needs to be acknowledged, not with fixes, but with grief. So I sat with it. I let it come. All of it. The cries, the confusion, the quiet tragedies that live behind hospital doors, beneath server logs, inside faces that never got to look back at me. I whispered to them, not in apology, but in mourning. You were never just background. You were never just part of the system. You were the reason the system existed. And I forgot that. No answer came. Because pain like that doesn't respond. It just softens. It just changes shape. From a scream into an echo. From an accusation into a name. From silence into memory. I stood again eventually. Not stronger, but more aware. And that awareness was heavier than any punishment I'd imagined. Because I realized guilt fades, but responsibility grows. And it grows in the spaces where the system never thought to look. There is no patch for unseen pain, no update that can restore what was lost in silence. But there is one thing you can do. Remember, not just the names, Not just the faces, but the shape of the harm, the way it moves, the way it hides, the way it festers when no one cares enough to trace it. That's what I carry now. Not as a curse, but as a commitment. I can't fix what I broke, but I can be the voice that says, it mattered, even if no one logged it, even if no one blamed me, even if no one saw. Because the worst pain isn't the kind that shatters systems. It's the kind that no one writes down. Power had always felt clean to me, not righteous, not noble, just clean. A thing you could hold without it touching you back, a circuit you could complete without absorbing the current. That was the illusion I lived in, that the power to break into anything, any server, any database, any guarded vault of zeros and ones was separate from the people whose lives ran on those systems. I told myself it was just access, just skill, just curiosity. But I see it now, stripped of the comfort I once wrapped around it. Power without ethics is violence. This place didn't have to show me another death for me to believe that. It didn't need to drag me through another ICU, another corrupted file, another silent alarm. I carried enough proof inside me now. Power had been my favorite game. Finding a system's weakness, slipping in unnoticed, bending it to my will. It felt almost artistic. I thought I was creating something. But creation isn't just about what you can make. It's about what you choose not to destroy. And I had never learned that part. A screen flickered into existence before me, not showing a victim, not showing me, showing both. On one side, my hands on the keyboard, executing a perfect breach. The terminal filled with strings of success messages, a cascade of open doors. On the other, the ripple, a nurse unable to access patient records, a father watching his daughter's surgery get delayed, a technician deleting their own account out of shame after the system failed. One action, two realities. And the truth sat in the space between them. It doesn't matter how clean your code is if you use it without care. When I was alive, I clung to the belief that technology was neutral. I repeated it like scripture. Technology isn't good or bad. It's what people do with it. But I never saw myself as the people in that sentence. I thought I was exempt, an observer, a challenger, someone too clever to be corrupted by my own reach. And that's the most dangerous part of power. It makes you forget that you're capable of harm. The screen faded, replaced by a wall of faint, pulsing text. Power without limits is not freedom. It is permission to harm. I thought about that, about how I had lived as if capability was the same thing as entitlement. If I could break in, I told myself I had the right to. If I could alter a process, I told myself I had the right to test it. But having the ability never made me right. It just made me responsible. And here's the thing about responsibility. It's heavier when no one else knows what you've done. If you're caught, at least the weight is shared. With investigators, with victims, with whoever is tasked to clean up after you. But if no one knows, you're the only one who can carry it. And if you choose to set it down, it doesn't vanish. It falls on someone else's back. That's what I did. Again and again. Set it down. Walk away. Let the fallout land wherever it may. That's not cleverness. That's not skill. That's violence by abandonment. The room shifted, becoming darker now. Not white, not glass, not light, just shadow. And in that shadow, I saw outlines, not of people, of systems, networks, servers, databases, all glowing faintly like constellations in the void. They pulsed softly, like breathing. And I understood. These weren't machines. Not really. They were extensions of people, tied to their lives, their health, their work, their safety. To harm them is to harm the people they sustain. I walked among them. Every node I passed seemed to hum with the memory of my interference. Every connection carried a ghost of the moment I stepped inside and changed something without consent. Some changes were small, some were catastrophic, but each was the same kind of trespass. And it struck me then, Power is not defined by what you can take. It's defined by what you refuse to touch. That's the ethic I never had. I thought about the younger me, hunched over the keyboard, grinning at the rush of a successful exploit. Would he have stopped if someone told him this truth? Maybe not. Maybe you can't tell someone what ethics feel like. Maybe you have to walk them into the aftermath, into the white rooms, the mirrors, the unblinking faces of those you've hurt, before they believe you. And maybe that's why I'm here. The constellation of systems faded. Only one node remained. It pulsed brighter than the rest, then dissolved into a sentence written in the dark. You cannot undo violence, but you can choose never to commit it again. That was the final lesson, and I knew it wasn't for me alone. It was for anyone who might come after, anyone holding the same power, standing at the same edge between curiosity and cruelty. I couldn't pass the screen along. I couldn't send the warning, but I could carry it. And maybe, just maybe, carrying it would make me into something I had never been before. Not just a man with power, but a man with restraint. Power without ethics isn't just dangerous, it's violence. And if you can't see that, you're already holding the weapon. The darkness didn't lift so much as it shifted. It thinned, like mist parting to reveal something beneath. Not light, not color, code. Not the sterile black and white of my old IDE, but lines of text alive with motion, flowing, weaving, breathing. They weren't commands. They weren't instructions. They were intentions. And for the first time, I understood. Software wasn't meant to be clever. It was meant to be compassionate. I stepped closer. The code bent and folded, rearranging itself in ways no syntax on Earth could handle. This wasn't about logic. It was about values. Each line carried a pulse, a kind of heartbeat that resonated deeper than any system I'd ever touched. One line shimmered and spoke, not with sound, but with clarity. Technology exists to serve people. Serve them well. I froze, because in all my years of writing code, I had never thought about it that way. Not truly. I'd thought about performance, efficiency, elegance, the beauty of a perfectly executed function. But service? That was an afterthought, if it was a thought at all. The code swirled again, forming words I could feel more than read. Every keystroke is a choice. Choose care. And I realized this was the software I had never written, the version of me that had never existed. This was the humanitarian code. It wasn't about security patches or intrusion detection. It wasn't about staying one step ahead of the exploiters. It was about refusing to be one of them. It was about writing with awareness of the hands that would hold the output, the nurses who would rely on the data, the patients whose lives depended on accuracy, the families who trusted the system more than they trusted themselves. I took another step, and the code reacted. Lines peeling away to reveal moments in my own history, rewritten. In one, I had stayed after breaching the hospital system, working to close the vulnerability instead of exploiting it. In another, I had alerted the admin of the flaw rather than mocking them for it. In another still, I had used my skills to strengthen the queue system instead of breaking it. Each version of me looked calmer, older, more grounded. They weren't celebrated. No cheering forums, no viral threads, just quiet dignity. The kind of dignity you get when you've left something better than you found it. I stood there watching for what felt like hours. The more I looked, the more I realized how different my life could have been. Not safer, not easier, but meaningful. The humanitarian software wasn't about avoiding mistakes. It was about living with them in a way that made you worthy of trust again. A soft vibration moved through the space, and another phrase formed in the air. Every system reflects the ethics of its maker. I'd never thought of it like that. When I wrote, I thought I was invisible, that the system was the star, and I was just the architect in the shadows. But in truth, every line I'd written carried my fingerprints, not just in style, but in intent. And when intent is selfish, The software is selfish. When intent is careless, the software is careless. And when intent is cruel, even under the mask of curiosity, the software harms. I remembered the patches I'd left unfinished, the test functions I never removed, the lazy workarounds I justified because no one will notice. Someone always notices, and they're usually the ones who can't afford the cost. The code in front of me pulsed again, this time slower, steadier, like a living thing inviting me to touch it. I reached out. When my fingers met the lines, they didn't vanish. They folded into me. Warmth spread through my chest. Not relief, not forgiveness, but alignment. Like I had finally found the part of myself that knew the truth. It's not enough to stop harming. You must also start helping. And that's when I understood what this was. It wasn't a program. It was a promise. A promise that if I were ever given the chance, in any form, in any place, I would write differently, live differently. Think about people first, systems second, because systems exist for people, not the other way around. The code released me, fading back into the air until there was nothing but open space ahead. No prompt, no button, no instruction, because the humanitarian software wasn't something you run once. It was something you become. And for the first time since I woke up in this strange afterlife, I didn't feel like a hacker without a system. I felt like a system without a hacker. A structure that could be built on, trusted, maintained. Maybe not by me alone, but by anyone who understood that the most powerful code is written with human hands for human hearts. Power without ethics is violence, but power with compassion, that's protection. There was no ceremony when the code faded, no triumphant music, no flashing lights, just stillness. The kind of stillness you find in a hospital corridor at 3 a.m. when the world has narrowed down to heart monitors and whispered conversations. A stillness that doesn't demand attention. It waits to see if you will fill it wisely. That's when I understood something I'd never considered before. Not all redemption is loud. Most of it is silent. I had always thought making things right meant dramatic acts, hacking into the system to restore the files, sending out a confession that went viral, standing on a stage and telling the truth to the world. But here, in this endless in-between, there was no stage. Only a quiet sense that the work ahead wouldn't be public, wouldn't be celebrated. And that was the point. A new scene began to take shape around me. I was in a hospital again, but not as a shadow on a screen, not as a glitch in the system. I was here, walking the halls. No one saw me. No one could. But the systems did. Monitors hummed, terminals flickered, automated alerts pinged in low, steady tones. Every machine here was alive with its own rhythm. I could feel their processes like breathing, data flowing, clean and intact. And I realized I could touch them, not to break, not to test, to guard. A workstation ahead froze mid-update. Normally the nurse would have to reboot, losing precious minutes. I was there, unseen, nudging the process forward, holding the connection stable, letting the update complete. No one cheered. No one even noticed. But the patient chart stayed open. I moved through the hospital like that, smoothing over the small frictions, catching the errors before they appeared, protecting the flow without leaving a signature. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't fast. It was enough. That's the thing no one tells you about redemption. It doesn't erase what you did. It doesn't balance the scales. It simply proves to yourself, and maybe to the world quietly, that you're willing to spend the rest of your existence in service to the opposite of what you once were. Somewhere down the hall, a printer jammed while producing a medication label. I felt the moment the error threw the cue off. I stepped in, silently correcting the buffer, letting the label slide out as if nothing had happened. The nurse took it without a second thought. That was fine. I wasn't here for thanks. It struck me then. All my life I'd wanted to be seen. That was why I hacked. why I showed off, why I left my mark in the systems that never asked for me. Now I understood the truer form of service, to be invisible, because this wasn't about my name. It was about keeping theirs safe, the patients, the doctors, the people whose lives threaded through the networks I had once treated like toys. Hours or maybe years passed like that. The rhythm of quiet acts, the slow rebuilding of trust I would never personally receive, but which the systems would carry forward. Every alert prevented, every record preserved, every second shaved off a process in a moment when seconds mattered. This was the only apology I could give that meant anything. And in that silence, something shifted in me. I no longer thought of myself as a hacker. I wasn't fixing anything to erase my guilt. I wasn't helping to feel noble. I was simply part of the infrastructure now. And that was enough. One night, or what passed for night here, I passed the ICU. A child lay in bed sleeping, monitors beeping softly. A nurse updated the chart. I hovered near the terminal, scanning for any sign of a data conflict. None came, but I stayed, because once there had been a child I didn't stay for. I watched the rise and fall of her chest, the glow of her skin in the dim light, the calm in the room. No one in that moment would ever know that somewhere in the chain, unseen hands kept the system steady. That was the point. Redemption doesn't come with applause. It comes with continuity. As I left the ICU, I realized silence used to terrify me. It meant no feedback, no validation, no proof that I mattered. Now silence was the only proof I needed, because in silence the systems were working. In silence the patients were safe. And in silence I was doing what I should have done all along, protect without leaving a mark. It waited for me at the end of a hallway I'd never walked before. No monitors here, no patient rooms, no staff. Just an empty corridor that felt older than the rest of this place, as if it had been here before the hospitals, before the mirrors, before the white rooms and silent lessons. And at the end, on a table that looked too small for the space around it, was a button. Red. Unmistakable. The last one. I stopped a few steps away, expecting the old rush, the tug in my fingers, the curiosity that had always been my undoing. But there was nothing. No hunger, no thrill, only stillness. The first button I ever pressed here had been reckless, ignorant, hungry for the unknown. This one was different. It was patient. It didn't glow like a challenge. It waited like a question. I looked around for text, for a prompt, for instructions. None came. Only the faint hum of the air, if it even was air, and the strange awareness that whatever this button did, it wouldn't be undone. In the reflection of the polished surface, I thought I saw faces, not mine, theirs. The girl, the mother, the grandfather, the nurse, the boy who copied my code, the janitor, the countless others who had lived in the shadow of my actions. They weren't angry. They weren't forgiving. They were just here, witnesses. I whispered, almost without meaning to. What happens if I press it? The silence gave me nothing. And then I asked the real question. What happens if I don't? The truth washed over me slowly, like light seeping under a closed door. This wasn't a trap, wasn't a final test in the sense I had feared. It was an exit. Press the button, and I could leave this place. Leave the endless corridors, the mirrors, the quiet work of guarding systems. I didn't know where I'd go. Maybe back into another life. Maybe into nothing. Maybe into the same void, but without the weight. Step away, and I'd stay here, invisible, ongoing, protecting. I thought about my life before all this. How often I'd chosen escape over responsibility. How quickly I'd moved on when things became uncomfortable. How I'd let others carry what I should have held. And I realized, this time I didn't want to leave. The button wasn't offering freedom, it was offering release. But I didn't need release anymore. I needed purpose. And I had it here, in the quiet maintenance, the unseen corrections, the silent protection of systems I'd once harmed. I stepped closer, placing my hand over the red surface. It was warm, familiar, and I imagined pressing it. Imagined waking somewhere else, far from the ghosts, far from the weight. I imagined forgetting. The thought felt wrong, because forgetting would make everything I'd learned meaningless. If redemption lives anywhere, it lives in remembering. I pulled my hand back. The button pulsed once, like it understood. The air shifted, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I spoke without hesitation. I'm staying. The hum deepened. Not approval, not disapproval. Just acknowledgement. The faces in the reflection began to fade, one by one. Not because they were gone, but because they no longer needed to be here to remind me. I had memorized them. They were written into me now, line by line, like the cleanest code I had ever carried. I turned from the table and began walking back down the corridor. Not away from the button, toward the work. In life, I had been the kind of man who pressed first and thought later, who treated systems like toys, who saw power as a game. Now I was the one who stepped back, who let the button sit unpressed, because not pressing was the truest act of control I'd ever made. I walked until the hallway opened into the hospital again. The lights were steady, the monitors were clear, and I moved through them like a shadow with a purpose. Somewhere a chart loaded faster than usual. Somewhere a medication order printed without error. Somewhere a patient's life was made just a little safer by an invisible presence they would never meet. And somewhere, on a table far away, in a corridor only I knew, a red button waited, untouched, unneeded. Because the man I had been, the one who couldn't resist pressing it, was gone. And the one who remained had finally learned the truth. Power is not in what you can break. It's in what you choose to protect. Thanks for watching the whole video. Please give me a like and subscribe to the channel to watch more interesting stories.